It's Reconciliation Week. It's a special time of year, so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the elders past and present of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's really my pleasure to introduce Pat Mokhtarian, who's been visiting here for just over a week. She's from Georgia Tech University. Pat's a transport researcher with a real specialty in sort of explorations and understandings of the influence on attitudes on the way we travel. Not only explorations, but actual quantifications. She's made a really substantial contribution to our understandings of that area, and also our understandings of the way we appreciate our travel time and the way that we sort of have this innate desire and need to be able to travel in our lives. Having said all of that, hand it over to Pat to maybe give a little bit of an introduction of where she's coming from, and then take it away.
Great, thank you. I forgot to check out the operation here, but I guess I can use arrow keys. This looks intimidating, so I'll use arrow keys.
I also forgot to mention, Pat will be talking for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have time for questions afterwards.
Great. Yeah. So thank you so much, Jen. I've really enjoyed the time with you, and so it's been great to have the opportunity to come to Australia, a country that I've enjoyed visiting several times in the past and hope to come back in the future. So the talk today, I've already gotten glimmers of expectations that maybe I'm going to present solutions. I don't have solutions. I have data and some interesting findings. So I think it remains to be worked out what the solutions are to the issues that this kind of conversation might raise. But I hope you'll find it provocative. I should preface everything by saying this is U.S. data, specifically California data, so I'm fully aware that Australia is different, and so it will be interesting in the Q&A to enlighten me on some ways in which what we're seeing in the U.S. may or may not apply here. I definitely also need to acknowledge my co-authors. Giovanni Circella is really the principal investigator of the project that has collected this data. I've been heavily involved in designing the survey and a little bit in analyzing the data. But Giovanni's been first a postdoc with me and now a research engineer, but has a joint appointment. You'll see the two logos here. I spent the first 23 years of my academic career at the University of California at Davis and moved to Georgia Tech 3 years ago. But I also have an emeritus appointment at UC Davis. So Giovanni and I are both affiliations, so to speak, and Farzad Alemi is a PhD student at UC Davis who helped me a lot getting the data ready for this. So what is the motivation of this study? Well, we're interested in better understanding millennials, of course. A lot of people are talking about it, but we especially wanted to focus on their attitudes, lifestyles, and how those relate to their behavior. And of course, a big question for us is, how are these millennials different from previous generations? Or are they, is the first question, right? And so as you'll see as the talk proceeds, it's not clear that they're as different as some people might have thought, at least, again, in California, at least when you look statewide. So we're putting together this emphasis on attitudes, lifestyle, etc., together with factors such as economic variables, socio-demographic trends, adoption of technology, and so forth, to learn how these all relate. And I think one of the things that distinguishes our study from many others, not all others, but a focus on what are the aspirations of millennials for the future. Because in the US at least, the behavior of millennials is heavily confounded by the economic recession that we've been through for the past several years and are still in some ways coming out of. And so when we look at how different millennials are, It's always not been clear to me, at least, to what extent these differences are due to inherent differences in the way millennials think relative to their older cohorts versus sort of exigencies of constraints of economics and income and so forth. So we'll address all of these things. I think you've probably all thought of or heard discussed some of the stereotypes about millennials, that they're heavy adopters of technology, they're less dependent on cars, they're all about sharing and not as materialistic as before. They prefer urban locations, urban lifestyles, and more pro-environmental. So we'll again examine the extent to which these stereotypes apply in our sample. And putting those potential characteristics together with a number of external issues such as economy, such as the cost of operating and owning an automobile, such as demographic trends that, again, I think you've probably seen here too, delays in marriage and childbearing, the boomerang, children coming back to live with their parents after reaching adulthood and sometimes after having children of their own. So all of these things, don't need to go over them in detail, but all of these are playing into the reasons why the mobility of millennials might differ from those of previous cohorts. So as we were looking at the literature on millennials, and it's burgeoning because, again, a lot of people are interested in this particular group of young adults, we saw a couple of limitations, at least on most studies. One is that the attitudinal information is missing, and as Jen pointed out, that's been a specialty of mine and something that I look for first because it seems to me so central to our choices, our behavior, and usually well beyond sociodemographic characteristics. But national databases like the National Household Travel Survey in the U.S., almost no attitudinal information whatsoever. And the other limitation that we saw frequently was the use of convenience samples. I've done it, no shame in doing it, but we started to wonder how much of the apparent evidence on the differences in millennials' behavior was due to looking at samples that are decidedly not representative of the population as a whole. So with those limitations of the previous literature in mind, we designed this study. In which we definitely wanted to get a more representative cross-section, if you will, of millennials across the entire state of California. It happened to be funded by California-based organizations for the most part, so we focused on California first, but are eager to replicate the study to a large extent in Georgia. We'll have the opportunity to do that this coming year, and of course we're happy to collaborate with others to replicate it in other parts of the country or world, because I think it would be very interesting to see what's common and what's different across these different geographic contexts. So fairly long online survey. I'm famous for designing long surveys, and this one was a little long even by my standards, but we had it completed through using an opinion panel, so one of these commercial services that promise to give you, whoever you specify. So we had a very complex set of requirements for quota sampling by geographic region and neighborhood type. By neighborhood type, I mean urban, suburban, rural, so that we could get a good amount of coverage in terms of numbers of cases across the state for each of these regions and types. And we realized, of course, fairly early on that, well, if we only study millennials, then we've got the perennial question that statisticians are famous for, compared to what? So, you can't just study millennials without comparing them to something. But due to budget constraints, we didn't want to look at an entire cross-section of all ages of adults in the population. So we chose to compare millennials to the next generation up, if you will, and are defining millennials in this study as those who were 18 to 34 years old when the survey was conducted in 2015, and Generation X being the 35 to 50-year-olds at that time. So keep that in mind, because as I do all these comparisons that you'll be seeing in a moment, maybe one reason we don't see as big a differences between millennials and others as we might have expected is that the others are only the next generation up. For sure, if we had compared millennials to baby boomers, the differences would be more pronounced. But still, then those differences would have been even further confounded by stage in life cycle and so on. So I think this was a decent strategy, but one that has limitations of its own that we need to keep in mind. So let's see, this is California, you might have seen it before, and just to give you a sense of the complicated quota system that we had, we basically looked at the different regions of the state, and admittedly these acronyms are not at all friendly to people who aren't from California, but SCAG is Southern California Association of Governments. These are the acronyms of the regional planning agencies in the major metropolitan areas in California. So this is basically LA, Orange County, and other places except for San Diego. This is San Francisco, the Bay Area, Sacramento, the Central Valley, and everywhere else, basically. So these are trying to be color-coded. So, for example, in the SCAG region, we tried to get 290 urban and 290 suburban observations. In the San Diego region, 180 of each, and so on. Plus 270 across the entire state from rural areas, and split roughly in this ratio. We wanted to get, trade-off between making sure we had enough millennials, which was the key focus, but also enough Generation Xers to compare them to. So the target was 2,400 total sample size, but we also requested that the sample be meet certain targets with respect to age, gender, income, etc. So this was a very complicated order for the commercial panel vendor, if you will. And of course, they promised very eagerly to do anything we wanted at the outset, and I think made every effort to do so. So I think on the whole, the data are reasonably high quality, but they were forced to admit that they were having trouble meeting some of the target quotas in some respects. But I think, again, on the whole, it fulfilled our need of getting a wide representation across the state and not just focused on urban areas or large urban areas. And then afterwards, we weighted the data set so that it would be representative of California's population in those age groups on these variables. So that the descriptive results I'll be presenting momentarily are based on the weighted data, so I think they can be taken to be representative of these age groups, the respective age groups in California. Okay, so I'm moving along as quickly as I think I can so that I'll have time to discuss the actual descriptive results here in a moment. Here are the different sections of the survey, again, rather lengthy, so I won't go through each one, the contents of each one individually, but the ones I've put in red are the sections from which I've drawn particular variables that I think would be of interest for us to look at now. So basically we'll be looking at selected variables from each of these, but there are plenty of variables left that I didn't choose to present for interest of time. So I don't want to spend too much time on these pie charts. They're basically illustrating the distribution of the sample by region and by neighborhood type, if you will. Relatively similar distributions between millennials and Gen Xers across region. With respect to neighborhood type, then the millennials are more in the urban areas and less in the suburban areas than Generation X, consistent with one of the stereotypes that millennials tend to migrate or be attracted to urban areas. These are self-reported designations of their neighborhood. We're also doing much more rigorous land use characteristics of where they live, but for a quick and dirty overview, I think that will suffice. But it could also be interesting to look at the race distribution. Again, consistent with stereotype, millennials are less often Caucasian or white and more often ethnic, either of one type or multiple types, compared to Generation X. So that again is consistent with what we've been reading, at least in the US, about millennials. And again, consistent with expectations, more likely not to have children. The proportions with and without children are exactly reversed between millennials and Generation X. Incomes, again, exactly what you expect. Millennials have lower incomes than Generation X, so they just haven't been on the labor market as long, and therefore obviously aren't earning as much for the most part. So these are just background, but now here's a transportation one that says, all right, first of all, people living in urban areas have fewer vehicle miles traveled than people living in suburban areas. We kind of knew that all along. And then for both groups within each type of area, millennials travel less than Generation X. Again, exactly what we expected, but my question is, to what extent are these differences due to the fact that they're not in as good jobs, or that they don't have children to ferry around all over the place, etc., as opposed to a true lifestyle, permanent commitment not to travel by car as much. So we'll see some evidence on that later on, but still going through a few more descriptive statistics before we get to that. Again, just as background, commute mode choice, again, consistent with stereotype, millennials are less likely to drive alone, but still, that's by far the largest mode, most often chosen mode for commuting, with more than 2/3 of the millennials even driving alone. But, all the other non-drive alone modes are more heavily used by millennials than by Generation X. So again, consistent with stereotype, but is that a dramatic shift? You decide. And then again, as we would expect, millennials are more likely to multitask while commuting. I don't know that we really need this separated out by region for you, but if you just look at the red portion of the stacked bars, comparing between millennials and Generation X, the red portions are taller across the board for all different regions. For millennials and for Gen X, meaning that millennials are more likely to be multitasking while commuting. So this is a brief tie-in to the talk I gave on Tuesday, but just in case you were at that talk as well, totally different data set, so don't be confused. This is an entirely different survey and study. But again, stereotypes are holding. Certainly they're more familiar with Uber, so more likely to have actually used it, and therefore less likely to have heard of it but not use it compared to Generation X. But again, relatively low usage when you look across the state as a whole. Probably not surprising because Uber isn't everywhere in the state, certainly not at all in rural areas, and probably less available, if available at all, in many of the suburban areas or smaller cities. But it may be of interest to look at the impact of the last Uber trip and try to compare millennials and Generation X. So millennials are less likely to say that the last Uber trip reduced the amount of driving that they did, maybe because they were driving less to start with, but again, we don't quite know that. Slightly more likely to say it reduced the amount of walking and biking I did compared to Generation X. So that's bad, right? Because it's reducing the amount of walking and biking is not a good thing. What are they with respect to public transportation? And similar with respect to reducing my use of public transportation, also not necessarily good. So Uber kind of replacing use of transit. Now down here, we realize that for some people it can increase the amount of walking, biking, it can increase the amount of use of public transportation. This one I didn't have room to put it all in, but it's by providing a better way to access public transportation. So as kind of the first mile or last mile access mode, Uber is helping some people increase their use of transit, or in this case, by providing a ride outside public transportation operating hours, so that they may use transit for one leg of the trip and then on the return take Uber home. So it is helping for both to increase the use of transit in some ways, a little bit more for Generation X, interestingly, than for millennials. But for both groups, the occasions on which it's reducing public transportation seem to be outweighing the ones on which it's increasing. the use of public transportation. So a little bit of, unexpected signs there, if you will, but something that we need to be aware of. Then, okay, coming to now attitudes. So behavior is one thing, but again, I'm curious about their attitudes and the extent to which they differ between Generation X and Generation Y, or the Millennials. So I've invented this concept called overlap. I say I invented it with tongue-in-cheek because I feel sure that somebody has done this before, but I just haven't seen it done in this particular way. So if anybody is aware of others who have used this metric, if you will, please let me know so that I can properly cite and credit the originator, or at least a previous user of this idea. But here's what I'm trying to do. Basically, imagine a variable with multiple responses, and I just showed two for simplicity. So imagine that we've got a question for which you can either disagree or agree, and we have millennials and we have the Generation X group. So when I talk about overlap, I mean for a given response, what is the highest share that I can say is true for both groups? And that turns out to be the minimum number in the column, i.e. the minimum across the groups. So it takes a little bit of bending your head around highest share is the minimum across the groups. But basically this says, for both millennials and Generation X, at least 30% of each group disagree with this statement. Okay? And similarly for the agree, I can say, for both groups, at least 40% agree with this statement. All right, so those are the amounts of overlap for each of those responses separately. And then if I add up the amount of overlap across responses, I get the total overlap in responses for that question or that attitude across groups. Does it make sense, more or less? If you didn't quite follow the logic, at least just get the general idea that bigger overlap means more similarity between the groups across all the responses, and the overlap can range from 0% if the distributions are completely disparate or not overlapping at all, and it could be 100% if the distributions are identical between the two groups. So I'm going to be using an overlap metric to assess how different millennials are from Generation X with respect to several different attitudes coming up. I didn't compute this for all attitudes, but just for ones where I was particularly interested, just to save time. So here will be some bar charts where I don't have them for all of them, but again, just attitudes that may be interesting. Actually, these were ones that my co-authors just did, but the two on the left are, again, exactly what you'd expect, that millennials are still trying to figure out their career to some extent, much more likely to agree or strongly agree with that kind of statement than Generation X, and less likely to be well established in their field of work or to disagree that they are, more likely to disagree that they're well established. But these two are the ones that I was interested in on this page, namely, I prefer to live close to transit even if it means I'll have a smaller home and live in a more crowded area. So again, consistent with stereotype, millennials are more likely to agree or strongly agree with that statement than Generation X. But what struck me most about that plot, if you will, graph, is how similar the distributions are, right? It's really not that dramatic a difference, and the overlap is 95%. Similarly, how committed are millennials to taxing gasoline, to pay more for gasoline to reduce the negative impacts on the environment? Well, more likely to strongly agree, a little bit less likely to agree, so kind of a wash almost on the agrees. More likely to be neutral, overlap 90%, right? So again, rather similar distributions of attitudes between the two groups. We'll see several more of these. I didn't do any of the overlaps on these because they're more about technology, and again, just as you would expect, millennials, the top one isn't, it's more about peer pressure and stuff, but the millennials are more likely to use the smartphone to deal with combinations of things, complicated trip planning. It's essential to have Wi-Fi or 3G, 4G connectivity. More likely to agree with that. More likely to use a smartphone to identify possible destinations. So all of those are consistent with expectations. Although again, to me, these distributions are not stunningly different. So they're different, but not very maybe. But let's come to this one. Are millennials so non-materialistic? They're all into sharing instead of owning? Well, not according to this statement. We say, I prefer to minimize the material goods I possess. Millennials are much less inclined to agree with that and more likely to disagree that they prefer. Again, it could be economically driven, that because they came of age during the recession, they've been deprived or feel deprived, and are not about to want to minimize the material goods they possess. But for whatever reasons, I don't see signs of opting out of buying things or into sharing extensively rather than owning. So, but again, considerable overlap even on this question, and the non-overlap is in sort of an unexpected or negative direction. How about their attitudes toward cars in particular? I definitely want to own a car, so considerably, a little bit less likely to agree or strongly agree than Generation X. But let's face it, 75% of them still definitely want to own a car. So the overlap here, 94%. Having children means you have to have a car. They're even more inclined to agree with that than Generation X, or again, probably a wash when you look at the two agree columns. And here the overlap is practically universal. So again, attitudes toward cars don't seem to be dramatically changing. What about desire for future mobility? So we asked them a series of questions about what they saw themselves doing or being and so forth 3 years from now. We also had train and maybe some others, but I just picked these. So 3 years from now, I would like to travel by car. This is actually the statement with the smallest amount of overlap of the ones I computed, but it's, again, sort of an unexpected or wrong direction, that they were considerably more likely than Generation Xers to say 3 years from now I want to travel by car more than I'm doing now. So that again doesn't signify that they're forsaking the car to any great degree. And by bus, they were interestingly more likely than millennials, than Generation X, to both want to do it more and to want to do it less than they currently do. So again, not as much overlap there. The walking, they want to do it both more and less, again to some extent, and still a lot of overlap there. Again, they want to do it more than they're currently doing, and lots of overlap. So again, to me, I'm seeing overlaps of at least 88 to usually well into the 90%. What about this one, the attractiveness of various modes? We asked overall, so we had a bunch of individual perceptions like comfort, convenience, cost, etc., environmental friendliness, whatever, with respect to a number of different modes, and I'm just showing you 3 here. But we started each of those lists with overall as a means of travel for me. How would you evaluate this mode from very bad to very good? And so personal vehicle, again, millennials less likely than Gen Xers to consider it very good and more inclined to be neutral about personal vehicles, but overlap 94%, still quite positive about automobiles in general. Public transportation, again, more inclined to see it as good or very good than Generation X, less inclined to see it as very bad or bad, but still lots of overlap. And active transportation, again, more positive attitudes there, slightly counteracted there, but overall quite similar attitudes between the two groups. So I think, that's all of those computations, but again, you may be thinking, and I was certainly thinking, all right, so they're different, maybe not very different. So my skeptical question is, maybe even those small differences would disappear once I account for income, for marital status, for presence of children, because maybe those are partially accounting for the differences in attitudes that we're seeing. So I did a little bit of experimenting. When I say quick and dirty, I mean quick and dirty, so there's a lot of things that need to be cleaned up before we submit this for publication. But I took 3 of the attitudes that you've just seen and treated them as dependent variables in the simple regression model. It should have been ordinal response and all of that, but again, quick and dirty. So I said, well, let me try to explain each of these 3 attitudes as a function of just sort of standard sociodemographic variables: income, employment status, marital status, and presence of children, and see if, once I account for the influence of those variables on each of these attitudes, does being a millennial matter after that. So I first did regression models with those 4 variables in them, and then added a dummy variable for being a millennial to that model to see if it was significant after accounting for those first 4 variables. Well, here's a start on the answer. So these are each of the 3 dependent variables, and just the signs of the coefficients of the millennial dummy variable and the p-value. So again, if you remember your statistics, the smaller the p-value, the more significant the result. And we usually try to look for p-values of 0.05 or smaller. So when we look at the results here, after including all those other variables and then adding a millennial dummy variable, that was positive. So that's the expected sign, meaning that millennials are more likely to want to live close to transit, or agreeing more with wanting to live close to transit than non-millennials. But the statistical significance is weak by anybody's standards. A 0.1 p-value would be often considered insignificant. But I put it here because 0.1 is, showing a tendency. The fact that the sign is in the expected direction suggests that maybe, okay, there's a difference. It's just not strong enough to be statistically significant yet. But I was telling Jen earlier in the week that, there's some classic studies in transportation in which they sort of ignored results that were this marginally significant, but there were a whole bunch of results that were similarly marginally insignificant, that when you compiled them all together into a meta-analysis, they were collectively extremely significant. So I didn't want to disregard this, even though it's borderline or marginal, of marginal significance, again, since it's in the expected direction. Similarly with the personal vehicle, how would you rate personal vehicles overall as a means of transportation for you? The millennial dummy variable had a negative coefficient, meaning millennials were inclined to rate personal vehicles as more bad for them. But again, marginal significance, right? And then the interesting one was the definitely want to own a car. It was so insignificant. P-value of 1 means it's 0, right? And so this is essentially 0. The coefficient was positive, but because of the p-value, you should really just interpret it as random noise around 0. So being a millennial, in other words, once accounting for those other variables, millennials were no more or less likely to definitely want a car than somebody of an older cohort. Basically meaning that it was those other variables, if anything, that was accounting for that attitude, not being a millennial per se. Well, so maybe you're like me, because I'm trying to be as generous to the possibility as I can that there are differences. So I'm thinking, well, maybe the millennial dummy variable is too crude, because after all, older millennials are a lot like younger Gen Xers, and so maybe there is an age-related trend that's just not coming out strongly enough when I have a dummy variable there. So I redid the regressions where instead of the millennial dummy variable, I included just straight age, okay? And there, so the sign switched, which is what you'd expect, right? Because this says that the millennial dummy variable means 1 if you're a millennial and 0 if you're older. So you would expect the opposite effect when a higher value of age means older and a lower value is younger. Over here, higher meant younger, lower meant older. So the switch in signs is expected. P-value suddenly considerably more significant, right? So that is kind of a smoking gun. It says, all right, well, attitudes are changing, that the older you are, the less you want to live close to transit, or conversely, the younger you are, the more you want to live close to transit. It's just maybe that they're changing so gradually year by year that we didn't detect it very well over here with the cruder indication, but strongly significant when you include age per se. But then I get to this one, and say, well, sign didn't switch, but again, it doesn't really matter because it's essentially 0. It's bobbling a little bit on either side of 0. P-value 0.8 again just means age was irrelevant to your desire to own a car or not. So that was a little discouraging, but and I guess to further add to the angst, the R-squareds for these regressions were quite small, and that's totally consistent with my own experience in trying to predict attitudes as a function of sociodemographic variables. It almost never works very well because apparently you can have attitudes regardless of your income or your marital status or whatever. So there must be some effect, but obviously quite little, as you can tell from this. And what that means is that if we were to find a few more variables that we're currently missing, certainly this effect could disappear entirely, and even this effect, So in other words, age might be standing in for some other variable that I didn't think to include in the base equation, and that once we include that variable, or we just may not have the variable, but it's one that we should ideally have accounted for, and that once we do, it's not really age that's having that effect, but the other variable that's currently lacking. So when the R-squareds are that small, it's pretty easy for variables that are currently in the model to get kicked out if you find other variables that really should be there. So I wouldn't put a whole lot of weight on these variables, on the age variables being strongly significant with R-squareds that small, is what I'm saying. But just one more model, and then I'm almost finished. What about the vehicle miles traveled? So there too, we saw earlier that millennials, as expected, traveled less than Generation X. And so again, the question is, to what extent is that because they're in lower paying jobs or don't have children, etc. So here, first of all, I log transformed vehicle miles traveled, which is fairly conventional in transportation, to make the dependent variable more normally distributed. And you need to add 1 first, because some people would have 0 VMT, and log of 0 is negative infinity, and models don't like that. So by transforming zeros to add 1 to them, then we'd be taking the log of 1, which is 0, so that works out nicely. So log of VMT plus 1 is our dependent variable. The explanatory variables were the ones I showed you before, plus a few more like gender and cars per licensed driver and population density of their residential neighborhood. So again, the question is, once we account for all of these, does being a millennial matter, right? And so the answer is, again, the expected direction and marginally or borderline insignificant or borderline significant, depending on how you want to look at it. So the negative coefficient on the millennial dummy variable does say that millennials tend to have lower VMT, but again, the significance of that is certainly marginal. But when I replace millennial with age, and I'm following Giovanni's model that he had done, again, sort of a draft model, but he had used age and age squared, which is useful and not uncommon when you're modeling VMT, because there is sort of a nonlinear relationship of age to vehicle miles traveled. When you're younger, you do it less because, again, your jobs are closer to home and you don't have kids and a spouse and so on. As you get older, your travel increases and tends to peak. I think what I've usually seen is it peaking later, like in the 40s, but here, based on the coefficients of age and the square of age, we found a peak in VMT occurring around age 34, but strongly significant. And again, though, if the peak is occurring at the upper end of the millennial years, I'm not sure what that's saying about millennials per se, not, whether they've really changed or whether they're, again, just sort of acting characteristic of people with the marital status and presence of children and so forth that they would have. So interesting, the R-squareds in that model are much better. Again, we're usually doing better at predicting behavior than attitudes with these kinds of variables. So that's fairly typical for a model of VMT. So now I'm wrapping up. So just to summarize, yeah, we found a lot of things consistent with expectations, stereotypes being fulfilled and so forth. But what, at least my takeaway, is that the attitudes of millennials are not particularly different from those of Gen Xers. Maybe on their way to being different, so just not as dramatically different as perhaps we might have expected. It seems quite strongly clear that they want to own a car. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll use it as often, but they do think it's important to have one, and certainly think it's important to use one. So even if they end up using Uber more and so forth, they're still using cars. More likely to want to travel by car more than they currently do. So it's, again, suggesting to me that the behavioral differences we're seeing now are probably largely a result of stage in life cycle and income issues and so forth, than a fundamental shift in attitudes yet. Although, as I say, I think attitudes are probably changing gradually with age, and that as time progresses, we'll see continued progression in that regard. And I didn't say it here, but I've said it to people earlier in the week that, you know, even if what we're seeing is largely a delay, a factor due to the delay in marriage and childbearing, that delay is still beneficial to the transportation system. So the fact that several more years have gone by for millennials not having a car than would have happened in years gone by is still a benefit, even if eventually they catch up. And do get a car. And there's also evidence suggesting that they're not going to catch up entirely, you know, that to some extent there'll be fewer getting married, fewer having children than in the past. And so the travel patterns of those people who don't get married and don't have children will continue to be dampened, I think, relative to what it would have been otherwise. So overall, I think it's, you know, reasonably good news, but just not as dramatically good as perhaps we might have expected. There's a whole bunch of wordy slides on next steps of lots of interesting things we can do with this rich data set, but I'll just kind of skip over them fairly quickly and let you spend the rest of the time asking questions. So there is a new report out, which doesn't have very much of what I presented today, but it does have lots of the descriptive statistics. It just doesn't have the overlap computations and the focus on how different are they that I've put into this talk. But the report is publicly available if you're interested in lots of data analysis at this initial stage. Lots of people provided input to designing the survey and to initial analyses, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes.
I'm just wondering how much of the presence or absence of public transport and city structure would account for, I mean, if you consider that as a variable, then...
Right. Yeah, that's why I did include the density as, again, a quick and dirty proxy for urban form and presence of transit and so forth in the BMT model. And it was strongly significant, so it does have the effect as you would expect. So absolutely, you know, a lot of that's one of the differences to some extent between US and certainly Europe and perhaps Australia too. Lower densities overall, lower transit level of service overall. So of course that's going to affect people's, you know, sense that they definitely want to own a car and so forth. That's why it would be useful to do this elsewhere with other transit configurations. Yes?
Yeah, related to that last question, do you expect your Atlanta survey to show a sort of a more suburban result? Because Atlanta would be more car dependent.
Well, you know, it'll be Georgia-wide, and Georgia-wide is, you know, outside of Atlanta, it's going to be highly car dependent. Inside Atlanta, there are transit options, and you know, there's Midtown Atlanta is a magnet for millennials, at least stereotypically, because you can live there and walk and you know, take transit conveniently to a lot of activities. So I would expect that in Atlanta proper, you know, if we took, even with this sample, if we took San Francisco and, you know, the more urban core dwellers, of course, we'd see the stereotypes, but that was the whole point of not doing that, was so that we could get a more representative. And so, again, I think the message, at least in the US, is representative cross-sections are not really changing that fast, but again, in part because of constraints of land use and transit availability. Yes.
Two questions. First of all, there's been a lot written about how millennials are not great survey takers. And I wonder if you have any insights about different response rates. And I appreciate the fact that you used a very long survey. I like them myself. They're very out of vogue, but it seems like in your case it was worth it because you got richer data, or if you could talk about that. The second question is, if you flip it from the perspective of being a researcher to being a transportation planner, and I wonder if what you really shouldn't be interested in is this question of spatial sorting. So to the extent that a group with one preference sorts in one location, as a transportation planner, you might want to meet those preferences by providing more walking or transit opportunities, or perhaps in other places providing more car opportunities. There's been a lot of work recently across the political landscape that suggests that the millennials have a higher level of sort of ideological sorting than any prior group. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Okay, I'm going to step back because apparently I need to speak into the screen, which is where the microphone is, so I'm not withdrawing from the question. But yeah, so on that, you know, yeah, my own one of my own streams of research has looked at residential self-selection question extensively, and certainly that is a factor. That people select themselves into areas that are consistent with their predisposition to travel in a certain way. And so I'm absolutely in favor of providing more transit-oriented places such that, you know, I think those people with those predispositions are currently underserved. And, you know, a whole set of research questions around to what extent do people have auto-oriented attitudes because they've never had the opportunity to experience anything else, and, you know, the U.S. in particular. And so that if you provide more such areas, such that people may end up living there even if they weren't previously predisposed to do so, to what extent does that influence their attitudes over time and make them more transit-oriented? So I think there's still a whole lot of rich research questions as well as planning implications there. So I think on the planning side, you know, absolutely, you know, I support the desire to provide more developments like that in the U.S. Was that enough on the second question? On the first question, absolutely, response rate. So I struggle with this in all of my surveys, the trade-off. And, you know, in cases where I've done sort of random invitations, then in the past at least I've gotten quite good, relatively speaking, response rates on the order of 25%. I think those are sliding as time goes on, and that people are less inclined to spend time on a long survey. Although I do think, you know, care and design and making the questions well worded, interesting, engaging, etc. matters. In this case, because we were using a commercial opinion panel, basically, then that wasn't an issue. It was whoever would, you know, agree to take the survey, and they just kept raising whatever incentives they gave them until they met the quotas. So I'm still not, you know, entirely convinced that these are representative people, you know, are they professional survey takers? But of course we did check for speeders and excluded people who finished the survey too quickly. And we also inserted a couple of trap questions in the survey to kind of catch people who were just clicking without reading. And so, you know, I think we've done what we can, and I think given the constraints of budget and the need to make sure that we got this distribution across the state, you know, I think it was a reasonable choice, and the data seemed to be plausible. So I don't think we've got a lot of garbage or random responses in here. That's still an open question as to how different they are on unobserved variables that we don't have any way of weighting them to represent and so forth. But I think, you know, as strategies go, it's a reasonable one at this point for this study. Okay.
Can I just add to that? We've just been using a panel in Sydney and didn't put the strict quotas that Pat had put on her questionnaire. and without putting age quotas, their first run through produced 40% and 30% of over 65s respectively, and virtually none at the millennial age. And it didn't seem to be rubbish data. You know, if you did some cross tabs, the over 65 seemed to be retired and so on. So I think your question is right, that if you're going to use these panels, you need to be fairly clear about what your quotas are.
Yeah, that's a good observation.
Yeah, I'm interested in actually how to get more people on public transport, and whether or not, given the study, it looks like you treat them the same, because effectively the attitude is the same, but try and leverage this under 35s delay in purchase of a car or use of a car. So maybe that's a good tactic or a strategy. Is that
You mean a strategy to help them delay purchasing a car?
no, to get people onto public transport?
To entice them on before
Yeah,
they...
so one of the tactics could be that we actually target that group
Right.
in the situations that they're in, which is while they're not having a car.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's, and the other one was, when we're building these suburbs around, we're building the infrastructure, the transport, and we've got to build the suburbs generally, and a lot of the precincts and the areas surrounding. I'm getting the impression of appealing again to under 34s so that we constantly get these higher transport users and maybe create at least a few of these that appeal. The only thing is they're really far out
You're right.
of these sort of city centres
Right.
where most of them like to live.
Right.
So we've got this sort of complexity around how do we get millennials into suburban lifestyles if we want the uptake.
Right. Yeah, and again, in the U.S., trying to entice millennials to use transit is first and foremost giving them good transit service, and that's where we fall down. And so, we've got a real chicken and egg problem with the low density development that's virtually ubiquitous, not supporting transit very well. And so, unless you give people good service that is at least semi-competitive with the automobile, then of course they're going to need and want an automobile as soon as possible. So I think in places where transit service is good, then there is, a considerable share of choice riders, and that's definitely the tactic to engage in, is to try to, keep millennials using transit when they're in such areas where it's...
They get addicted.
Right. And
if they can, does that happen?
yes, and the talk I gave on Tuesday was a different study, but also looking at specifically things people do while traveling, and the idea being that was a competitive advantage of transit, i.e. that you can use the time semi-productively while commuting in particular. And so there was evidence that did influence mode choice, and so it was comforting to realize that, that is something that transit could tout, that would appeal to millennials. As I said there, it may be short-lived if autonomous vehicles come along and give the same hands-free advantage together with the flexibility and ubiquity of a private automobile. So, again, challenges that I don't quite know the answer to. Yes?
Probably following on from that answer, I was just curious because there seems to be there's a particular focus on looking at these attitudes from an age-related group, Millennial and Gen X. But have you found with these questions, it seems like there may be the material here, is there a correlation between families and internet use as well, between these types of attitudes from how you've looked at this data?
I don't know that we've specifically looked at that. Do you have a particular
Well, in other research that I've come across in relation to these types of behaviours, it seems that there is a correlation between internet use and licensure rate across countries. So
positive, meaning more internet use, less licensure rate? Oh.
So I was wondering if that helped.
Right. I think we will look more carefully at those relationships as time goes on. I was just saying to the colleagues in front earlier at the beginning that Alexa Del Bosque at Monash University recently published an interesting study looking, I don't remember, I think it was specifically millennials, or at least young people, young adults, and specifically looking at the question of is more internet use correlated with less travel in general, and found that it was correlated with more travel, which truthfully from my own years of research did not surprise me in the slightest. I think it's hard to sort out, controlling for everything else, because obviously there's an income confound, higher income people both use internet more and travel more. So, you need to control for as many of those things as you can, but I believe she did and still found, that the relationship was positive. So I don't think we fully appreciate the extent to which telecommunication technology stimulates travel, or at a minimum, makes it easier to do things while traveling, so it reduces the disutility of travel. So if anything, it's increasing travel. I had a question to that.
Yeah, could millennials be locked out of transit-rich inner city areas by house prices?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's happening in Sydney. When I think back to the 70s and 80s, a lot of students live in these areas, and most of the stock's been bought out by the older.
Right.
So even if millennials want to live in transit-rich areas, they simply can't afford it.
Right.
So they end up in apartments out of Parramatta or a long way out of the city.
Yeah, that's totally true. Yeah. So that again is a planning dilemma, isn't it? Yes.
How does the transportation system differ between, say, Sydney and California?
Ooh. Well, you have lots more trains. So, I think at least, the urban part of Sydney is much better served by train service, clearly. And I'm sure there's lots of bus service that I'm only less keenly aware of. So I think just in general, level of transit service is much higher here than in the U.S. in general. San Francisco, very well served by transit in general, and auto ownership is lowest in San Francisco of anywhere else in the U.S. except New York. So there is a place where you can subsist without cars pretty easily, but even there it's not as low as you might think. I don't remember offhand. So yeah, you guys have a much more transit-rich environment overall, and that again is a challenge for us for sure.
I think we've got time for just one more question. Does anybody have any?
Yeah. So I'm wondering how much do you think the difference between the two groups is just because of their age difference? I mean, for the millennial, they might get exactly the same attitudes or behave the same when they're getting old as non-millennial.
Mm-hmm. Right. Oh. Yeah. So what we can't tell is how much what is due to maturation, right? So the fact that attitudes in general change. So I could control for socioeconomic, etc., but there's these unobserved processes going on that just our attitudes change in general. And we don't know. A companion study, by the way, well, unrelated, but on the same subject. So with my colleague Ram Pindyala and his postdoc and a couple of other colleagues, we just had accepted into Transport Reviews a study looking at the time use data, American Time Use Survey, and basically, 2 waves 10 years apart. We could look at, they're different people 10 years later, but we could look at the 20 to 30-year-olds 10 years ago, and the 20 to 30-year-olds 10 years later, and the 30 to 40-year-olds 10 years later, and so forth, to kind of see what's happening to time use patterns across time. And finding, for most things we looked at, convergence, that as the 20 to 30-year-olds 10 years ago, now 10 years later, they're looking a lot like the 30 to 40-year-olds did 10 years ago, and so on. So for most variables, it seems like, again, delays, but converging to what the counterparts would have been in the past. But that's behavior, not attitudes, and ultimately only time will tell what's going to happen to millennials' attitudes, I guess. We hope this study can be a panel and do some repeated surveys of the same individuals in a couple or 3 years at least, so that we can sort of, we asked them, what did you want to do 3 years from now, kind of thing, or within the next 3 years, And it would be interesting to capture both their attitudes 3 years later and the extent to which their behavior matched what their aspirations were 3 years earlier.
So you're saying things change based on life stage, not a generational change, or like the year they were born necessarily. So I'm saying like 18-year-olds today maybe have very similar attitudes and behaviours to what 18-year-olds did have 20 years ago. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think they do yet, but the question is when they mature to 35, having been married and had children for a few years and having, you know, overcome the recession that damaged the start of their career, but now they've more or less caught up and so on, will their attitudes at 35 be like those of 35-year-olds?
Yeah.
You know, so, right, so I think there is a difference now that's a factor of a whole bunch of things. Including the socio-demographic trends as well as the economic background and so forth. So yeah, in my mind the question is, after those have had a chance to kind of settle out, you've gotten over the initial...
Are there still generational differences
right, exactly,
rather than life
right.
stage differences?
Exactly. And I think there would be, right? I mean, if you look, attitudes in society have changed over time. So I would fully expect them to be different, but how different and in what ways is the question.
All right, if you'd like to join me in thanking Pat.